and welcome to our second segment of Knit University. Thank you for all your positive feedback. As I've often said, anytime, we learn one little thing, it's always worth our time, I believe. And so we're going to let Lisa in. Want to let Lisa in up there?
Oh, I might let Lisa in.
There we go. Great. So this week, our topic is gauge. Hi, Lisa. So who better to talk about gauge than Susan? There's another one.
Oh,
she's on admit duty.
Yes.
To talk about gauge and Susan, our sweater coach. So as we discussed last week, and we will be putting these all up on our YouTube channel. So you might get selected. So if you don't want your picture on YouTube, you can turn your camera off. But we do want to make these public so that then we could say, hey, you want to learn more about gauge, go and watch this. So as we learned last week, we talked about weights of yarn, and that sometimes if you didn't have a label for your gauge to help determine that. We also learned that weights of yarn are not standardized. So even when they say worsted in the United States is different than worsted in Peru, different than worsted in Italy. And so a gauge could be necessary for that as well. Typically gauge is used in sweaters, but it can be used for other things as well. So Susan's going to talk to you about our gauge. And if you have a question, we learned that you could raise your hand on your screen, or we've got a small enough group that you can kind of wave at us and we kind of pause to see if you've got questions too. So,
or if it's urgent, I have no problem with you in, just shouting out too. So.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Sue. We're going to do some screen share as well when we get to that point. And she's going to talk to you about gauge. Thanks for being here.
Okay, well, in last week's video or lesson, you learned that within the category, there's lots of variation of yarn size. Okay, usually on the wrapper on a yarn, it'll give you a needle size range. And you also know that people knit very differently. So when do you need to do a swatch? You probably don't need to do when you're making something that's not fitted. A shawl generally, or a scarf, or cowl, something like that. You usually don't need to do a swatch. If you want something that fits well, you need to at least have an idea of your gauge. If you're knitting a pair of mittens or a hat, those are small enough items that they're not that much. A gauge that you've knit is almost as big as a hat or a mitten. So you can take your gauge off of you can go ahead and get your approximate or choose the size based on whether you're a loose knitter or a tight knitter or whatever the pattern gives you. And then as you get going, your gauge and see if you're on track before you finish the item out. And also at that point, you can probably sort of try it on. So the place where gauge is really important is in a sweater. A shawl or something like that, you probably don't need to do a gauge. But if you are using a unique kind of yarn, a different yarn than what the pattern calls for, or you're an exceptionally tight or loose knitter, you might want to do a gauge just to make sure that the amount of yarn that is called for in the pattern will get you through the project. If your gauge is overly loose, you may use up way more yarn than the designer did and end up running out your shawl will be bigger, which usually isn't a problem, but you may run out of yarn. So that would be a case where you might either move your needles, move up a needle size or down a needle size or two to get the correct gauge. Another thing that a gauge can be used for other than, or a swatch can be used for other than getting your gauge, is to see if your colors are working together well. Or maybe to practice the pattern, to see if you like the pattern, if it's an, like a textured pattern, or maybe even one that you're making up. Also, you get an idea of what your fabric's going to be like. And lots of times you can get gauge. Well, I don't know about lots of times, but if sometimes you'll get gauge, but you're really not happy with the fabric. It's too open or too tight and stiff, and you're not getting the drape that you need. So then what you need to do is change a needle size and see what gauge you are, get a fabric you like. You don't want to go to all the work of making something and not like the fabric, or have the fabric not be appropriate to the the object that you're making. So a swatch is just a set of stitches that you're going to knit up with the yarn that you're going to be using, the needles that you're going to be using. And usually it's just a little square. I like to look at the gauge. The gauge is usually given in a 4-inch square. So you'll count the number of stitches in the gauge. I keep substituting gauge for swatch. I really mean swatch. What you'll do is mark off 4 inches on your swatch and count how many stitches. You can do it with a 2-inch measurement or even a 1-inch, more accurate. And I think one of the reasons I use 4 inches is that pretty evenly translates into centimeters as well. 4 inches, 10 centimeters are really, for all practical purposes, the same. So, but of course, the bigger you get, the less chance there is for error. When you're measuring, when you're trying to count stitches in a 1-inch segment, when you get a partial stitch, it's a lot harder to estimate a 1/4 stitch or a 1/2 stitch. Whereas if you're out in a 4-inch measurement, those stitches are going to translate more into full stitches. You may still have a 1/2 stitch or a 1/4 stitch then, but it's not the margin of error then is smaller. So what you do, and I happen to have packed up all of my swatches and some other things for the shop today and came in without them. So I don't have swatches to show you, but I will show you how to count the swatch. But first of all, when I go to make a swatch, I don't try to make it just 4 inches, probably 5 inches wide. So I look at the gauge for the garment that I'm going to be making and say it's 20 stitches for 4 inches. That's a nice round number for me to work with. That works out just an inch. I will cast on those 20 stitches. What I'm going for is for those to be 4 inches. But I will add 3 stitches to each side. So probably an extra 6 stitches, so that, you know how the edges get kind of wonky to measure it. Sometimes your pattern will tell you whether you are to make your gauge in stockinette stitch or maybe garter stitch if your garment is garter stitch. Maybe with the pattern, I have a sweater on that's got all over pattern, and I had to make my swatch with the pattern and measure that because many patterns will pull the gauge in. So read your pattern, see what stitch you're going to be doing for your gauge, cast on that number of stitches plus probably 6. You can even go 8. Some people knit with a small border at the top, bottom, and sides so that their swatch lays flatter. I go back and forth. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. The important thing is to be able to carve out that 4-inch square in the middle of your swatch. Then I knit for at least 5 inches. And that's my swatch. Sometimes I'll bind off, sometimes I'll just run a waste thread through the live loops at the top. What you're going for is a close count at that. If it calls for 20 stitches per inch and I'm getting 20 and a half or even 21, I check the fabric. Do I like the fabric? Do I think it would be better a little bit looser, a little bit tighter? If you want a tighter gauge, you're going to go to a smaller needle. If you want a looser gauge, you're going to go to a large. And I might just do a row of garter stitch. Say I'm knitting on a size 7 needle. I've gone my 5 inches. I'm not really thrilled with the fabric. I want it to be a little bit looser. It's a little bit stiff. So I'd go up to an 8. I'd knit a row of garter bumps, and then I'd knit with my 8. And I might not actually go all 5 inches again, but I have some swatches where they turn out to be, you know, probably 8 inches tall by the time I've tried a variety of needles, or I might start a completely different swatch. It kind of depends. But you want a ballpark figure, and you want to record what you've counted as your gauge and mark that down on your pattern or someplace safe. In a minute, I will show you how I go about counting. It is kind of important on your swatches, and this is where I do wish I had the swatches, but it is important to mark your swatches with the needle that you have used. What you can do is take the tail of your yarn from your cast, number 7 needle. You can put 7 little knots in your cast on tail, and that will tell you that swatch was made with a size 7 needle. Another thing that you could do is to knit 7, if you're doing stockinette, to do 7 purl stitches on the stockinette side, and that will give you 7 little purl bumps. That is to mark your swatch. Another thing that you could do is to starting about a third of the way into the swatch, you can knit 2 together, do a yarn over, knit 2 together, do a yarn over on your swatch. And then when you knit back, you've left a series of little holes for the size needle. All of those are good. I prefer those to paper tags because you are going to wash that swatch. Once you've counted and gotten fairly close to a fabric you like and to the given gauge, then take your swatch, put it in a little tub of water. You can use wool wash, you can use just plain water, and let it soak till the fibers relax. If it's a wool, it's going to take half an hour or so, 20 minutes to a half an hour of letting it soak. That lets the fibers relax quite a bit, and then pull it out, wring the water out of it. I wrap it up in a towel and stand on it, and that weight of my, and then I just lay it out on a towel or a foam mat or something. Don't stretch it. Don't think, okay, now I have to block this out to gauge, because you want to see your stitches are doing naturally. So just pat it out, make it nice and flat, make it kind of even into a square, and let it dry. Once it's dry, then you're going to count it again. And here's what Angie, I need to get the phone on to. Oh, it did come on. That's still locked. We'll get you there.
Oop. No, I don't want to do that. Okay.
Okay. I'm going to screen share just to show where is my screen share.
Down low.
Down low. Huh. Cable share. Okay. Okay, being that I don't have my actual swatches. Yeah, I want it up just a little bit. Okay, I want to see what I'm doing.
No, 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 no.
Oh, no. Stitch off in big stitches, a big square, but this works pretty well. I just lay my swatch flat, put my T-pins in. These are 4 inches apart. I like to use a ruler that is a solid ruler rather than a tape measure because it's just a little bit more accurate. And then I line it up and I start counting my stitches. Now realize, well, my laying down here, I missed my 4 inches a little bit. Okay, now I had a little needle here. I have to have something in my hand when I go to count my stitches. So I'm going to get this all lined up at my 4 inches. And can you see this, or do I? I'm going to show you right along here as I count. I've got, this is a stitch. It makes a little V. And so I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, count every stitch, 6, 7, 8, 9, where am I? I'm at
2.
10, 11, 12, 13. That's as far as I'm going to go. I'm going to count it. I have roughly 13 stitches. However, do you notice that's actually coming right in the middle of that stitch? No, that's coming right between. I've got my V's going down. If it were over here, that's half a stitch. If it would come right in the middle there. So right here, you've got your V with the closing part of the V at the bottom. So that was 13 stitches for 3 inches. So I would divide that by 3 to get my stitch count per inch. But I have to, and usually when I count, I actually even lift up the leg of the stitch as I'm counting. But I think you get the point that it's important to be very accurate with your stitch count. Being off a stitch per inch, if you're knitting a sweater that has a 40-inch circumference, that could add probably 3 inches, 4 inches to your, or if you're an inch, if you're a stitch less, it will make your sweater too big. If you're a stitch more, it'll make your sweater maybe 3 inches less circumference. So it can make a difference. And of course, the larger the circumference, the more off you're going to be. So that's the thing about gauge that's a little bit disconcerting, is the fact that if you get too many stitches per inch, your knitting is too dense, too tight, and you need to go up a needle size or two. If there are too few stitches, then you need to go with a smaller needle. Cram those stitches together a little bit more. I think what were we talking about on Monday night when I did this, that it's kind of like if you took 7 people and smashed them into a church pew, they might be crowded and you would need fewer people to fit in that same space comfortably. That's kind of like your stitches. If they're too crammed in, want them tighter, you knit with a smaller needle. Okay. Hopefully that you got an idea of that. The other thing that I think I forgot to mention is when you're making your gauge, do everything, simulate as closely as possible the conditions that you'll be having when you're knitting your sweater or garment or mitten or hat or whatever. But, you know, be relaxed or have a glass of wine. What you want is your normal knitting. If you've just had a fight with your kids, maybe that's not the best time to swatch, unless you have one every time you're going to knit. I don't know. Anyhow, you want to simulate everything. So use the same needles, the same yarn, try to make it the same conditions. If you're knitting in the round, your swatch should be knit in the round. And there are a lot of YouTube videos that show you how to do that. What you basically can do is knit. You can cast on twice as many stitches and knit in a circle and get your gauge that way. If you don't want to do that, you can knit like a giant I-cord. I would cast on your regular number of stitches, and then you have to use a circular needle so that you have needle points at each end, and you will knit across, slide your knitting back to the left hand needle, drape your yarn across the back so you have a great big loop, and then knit across again. So you're just doing knit stitches. When you're knitting in the round and you're knitting stockinette, all you're doing is knit stitches. A lot of people have different tension between their knit stitches and their purl stitches. So when you're knitting in the flat, your gauge can be significantly different than if you're doing to check and see if your knit and purl stitches have different tension is look at a flat piece of knitting, flip it over to the purl side, to the wrong side of the stockinette, and look and see if you are kind of close together and then there's some gapping. If it's not real even, you may have a different tension on purl stitches than on knit stitches. I've tested it in that my knit and purl stitches are pretty even, so I can kind of get by without doing the swatching in the round. But I had a gal making a sweater one time, and it was knit, I think it was knit top, the down to where the armholes join, the back and the two fronts were knit flat, and then she joined and knit in the round, and you could see an incredible difference between the flat knitting and the round knitting. And we actually had to change her to a size 3, go down a needle size for her purl stitch rows. So she would knit with like a size 4 and come back in her purls with a 3 when she was make it match. once you get going with a project, you've done your gauge swatch, you've chosen your needles, and you've cast on and you're knitting. It's a good idea, once you get a significant amount of fabric, to take your ruler and mark off your knitting again and check your gauge. You'll, oh, my swatches always lie. And there are times when the weight of the fabric, or I don't know, just the number of stitches, things can change your gauge a little bit, but that's why I want you to always keep both your pre-washing and your post-washing gauge numbers somewhere on your pattern in a safe place where you can see them, so that you can refer back and check that your knitting is the same as it was on the swatch. And if not, you may, you can go ahead and change your needle sizes and make sure that you are getting the gauge. That doesn't happen very often, but it's kind of reassuring to know, yeah, I'm going to put all this work in and I am still knitting to that gauge. However, I did also have someone knitting a sweater, and it was knit in the round, and she got gauge and knit the sweater and started knitting on the sleeves, and the sweater was done in the round, but it was just, it was, on a larger needle, a larger cable. And so she didn't have, she just knit round and round. She went to do the sleeves and was doing the magic loop. And when you looked at the sleeve, you could see that when she was knitting in the magic loop style, she was knitting much tighter. So all she had to do was go up a needle size, and then it matched the rest of her body. So you do kind of periodically, if something changes, you do want to check your gauge and make sure you're still knitting to that same gauge. Any questions yet about anything? Let me see. The needle size that a pattern gives you is really just a suggestion. It's nice to have that suggestion there, because as you are beginning your swatching and finding your gauge, it's nice to know where to start. But just like knitting style was, whether they're, or the designer's knitting style was, whether they were a loose knitter or a tight knitter. So you may use a completely different needle. I have knit sweaters where I have had to go down maybe 2 needle sizes to get gauge. I'm not exceptionally tight, but I had a feeling that the designer, or maybe the yarn that they were using or whatever, was significantly different than what I was doing. And I've had to go down as many as 2 needle sizes. So, you want to get the gauge for you, but it is nice to have that suggested needle size as a jumping off place. Gives you a place to start. Let's see. What happens if you can't get gauge? If you can't get gauge, or you don't like the fabric you get at gauge, what are you going to do? You still want to knit that sweater. You still want to use the yarn that you have. You can do a little bit of math. Figure out the circumference of the sweater that you knit, that you want, and you can figure out how many stitches you should have on your main body of the sweater to get that circumference with your gauge. And then you can look for a size in the patterns schematic in the finished pattern to give you that sweater. What I'm saying is you might go up a sweater size, you might go down a sweater size. If you have a more stitches per inch, which means your fabric is tighter, you may have to go up a size or two. And I'm not going to go through all the math here, but if you think about it, you can probably figure it out. But I have, just as an experiment this past summer, and I may have told this to some of you before, but I knit a sweater with a light fingering weight, but the pattern was written for a DK. And I think it was knit on size 7 needles, and I knit mine on 3s. And I think normally I would have knit the 2nd or 3rd size, and I knit the very largest size that was there, and it did fit. So that gave me some confidence. The thing you have to worry about is I knit in length, like for the armholes, to my original size rather than to the size in the extra large pattern. And that's where making a sweater for yourself, you do have some control. You get to decide, maybe, if you're 6 feet tall and weigh 130 pounds, you're going to be knitting a small sweater, but you may need extra length throughout the sweater. And so you need to pay attention to that. We didn't really talk about row gauge. I completely glossed over that. And row gauge is important. I would say stitch count gauge is most important for getting the width to fit. Row gauge comes into play when you're doing sleeve decreases or waist shaping. If row gauge is significantly off in a raglan sweater, you may end up with having done all of your increases and your armhole may not be long enough. You can check on the schematic what the length should be, and you can just continue knitting before you join your sweater, or before you join front and back, or before you take the sleeves off. You can knit further, or consequently, you can do some extra decreases, or not decreases, increases in that raglan line if you are coming out with a much larger row gauge. And so you don't want your sweater is not going to look like it fits if your armhole goes halfway down your body. So you don't want that to happen either. So you do pay attention to that, but most of the time we'll say knit to 15 inches or knit till your armhole measures 8.5 inches or something like that. So pay attention there. It isn't just when you finish the decreases that you can pull your sleeve stitches off. Let's see, anything else that I need to mention? Look over at my notes.
Have not.
Okay. So
no.
She doesn't know if I left anything out.
You talked about washing, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was the only thing I thought.
Yeah, that when you're washing your swatch, make sure you treat it like you're going to wash your sweater. If you're, I don't know, I never do that. I wet block almost everything. And because that's how I wash my sweaters. I soak them and lay them out. I usually don't unless I've made a mistake with my gauge and gotten it too tight and I might want it a little wider. You do have a little bit of give in your blocking to make your sweater fit a little bit better, but not a ton. It's much easier to get your gauge set, knit to your gauge, and have done good measurements on your body. So anyway, are there any questions? Heads nodding back and forth. Okay, well, I think that,
No questions?
no questions.
Have any of you run into any gauge issues that you would like help with, that you sometimes, because Susan's a perfect person to ask about a gauge challenge you might have run into?
I will say on a designer's pattern, kind of read all that introductory information that she gives, because she will tell you, I say she, they will tell you what kind of ease is built into that sweater. For example, a designer might say, sweater shown in the picture is the 32 or the 36-inch sweater with 4 inches of positive ease. That means that the person modeling the sweater had a 32-inch chest. And so there's 4 extra inches of fabric in that sweater. If that person were to knit a pattern to 32, some sweaters are meant to be that way. Socks you knit with negative ease, but generally sweaters, you want some ease. Nowadays with the boxy sweaters that are knit with 14 inches of ease, 20 inches of ease, you get to decide. If you normally knit, say, the 3rd or 4th size, but the designer says that has 16 inches of positive ease, and you say, no, that's not for me, you go ahead and knit the size that is 8 inches of positive ease or whatever it is you want. You know, the pattern is really just a recipe. And you know how you can change recipes and things still come out most of the time.
Unless you're baking bread.
So,
all right. Any other questions?
Oh, I know one other thing. Usually you don't have to worry about not having enough yarn if you have bought the amount of yarn that is in the pattern, suggested in the pattern, because designers do expect you to swatch, and they do usually add in that amount for swatching.
But you do keep your swatches, don't you? Just in
I
case.
do. I keep my swatches. And I think only once I've had to unravel my swatch and use it to finish off my garment. But, and there was another time where I ended up with about a yard of yarn left before going to my swatch. So sometimes you do hit it pretty close. It does depend a little bit on how big you make your swatch. You know, if you make 4 swatches, I'd save them all. Excuse me.
All right.
But generally speaking, it's planned for, and designers do want you to make a swatch because they do want you to make a garment that fits.
Fabulous. All right. Thank you for being on. And next week, our schedule is on the calendar, says Ravelry, but it's actually going to be finishing your knits. We've had to flip our teachers around because of a schedule conflict. So next week, Cindy will be teaching about blocking, finishing, how to care for your knits, all of those things. And then the final week will be our Ravelry week, where we teach about that. So for being on, stay warm and keep knitting.
Great weekend for knitting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.